on Global Player. And
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. Sir Keir Starmer's told LBC Rishi Sunak broke the ministerial code during last night's TV debate. The Prime Minister's been accused of lying when he said Labour's policies would cost households £2,000 in extra taxes. The Tories say that would be over 4 years.
The Prime Minister resorted to lies. He knew very well what he was doing. He lied about our plans, and that is a true test of his character, someone who resorts to lies when he's under pressure.
It's being looked into by the statistics watchdog. Deputy Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell's told LBC there's no issue.
These figures are all independent of the Conservative Party. They are figures from third parties, and also, in my view, they are a massive understatement.
Meanwhile, the Lib Dems say the Tories have a record of raising taxes. The SNP are unhappy that Scotland wasn't mentioned in the debate, and Reform are promising to be a nuisance in Westminster. A 9-year-old girl injured in a drive-by shooting in Hackney a week ago remains in a critical condition. 3 men who were also shot in Dalston have been sent home from hospital. There have been no arrests. And members of the royal family join veterans on both sides of the Channel to remember the D-Day landings that happened 80 years ago tomorrow. There have been commemorations in Portsmouth and Normandy. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 24 points at 82.56. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. LBC weather: showers in the north tonight, drier elsewhere and a low of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. 2 minutes past 8 here on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. Joining me on the panel tonight, we have Steve Norris, former Conservative MP and Transport Minister, Parmjit Dhanda, Labour campaigner and former MP and Minister in the Blair and Brown governments, who's now Executive Director of the Back Heathrow campaign to support the airport's expansion. Stephen Bush is a columnist and Associate Editor at the Financial Times, and Salma Shah is a political commentator who was Special Advisor to Sajid Javid when he was Home Secretary. They're here to answer your calls. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can WhatsApp us on that number too, and you can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's crack on with our first caller. It's our old friend Sean in Concert. Hello, Sean.
How you doing, mate? How are you doing, panel? I'll tell you what it is. The rich people, right, of the NHS, should they get free treatment? Because I think it's an absolute disgrace that they get free treatment, rich people.
What, so anybody that's got private healthcare should be banned from using the NHS?
No, I never said that. I said rich people.
How do you define rich?
Well, over £100,000, £200,000 in the bank. Why the hell should they get free treatment?
OK. Steve Norris.
Because they're taxpayers and because the service is free at the point of demand based on your need rather than your means. Actually, I think what's good is that many people who can afford to do so recognise that it's best if they take themselves out of the NHS queue and allow people who don't have an alternative to take their place while they can afford to have some sort of private provision. Rishi Sunak himself, if you recall, came to that view when he was first asked, do you have private medicine? And he said, and then subsequently, it, of course, emerged that he did. And every single one of us said to him, the answer is very straightforward. You're rich enough to take yourself out of the queue. So your caller, I think, has got it completely the wrong way around. The reality is it's there as a system which every single taxpayer in this country, indeed people who don't pay tax, can access. And if you're wealthy enough, well, yes, I do think there's every prospect of you saying, well, I'll take myself out of the queue. Simple as that.
But of course, the private healthcare can't cope with every single demand. Like, for example, most private hospitals, in fact, I think probably every private hospital doesn't have an A&E department.
Yeah, that's right. And for that, you pay your taxes, and this rich person that your call is talking about will be paying quite a lot of tax. In fact, if he's earning 200,000 a year, about half of that is going to be going to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I reckon he's entitled to go to A&E any time he needs to.
OK, Parmjit.
It's quite interesting. I used to serve on a hospital trust, Milton Keynes, very good hospital. And it's amazing the number of people who do go private and then when things go wrong end up back in the NHS anyway. I just think there's something really, really important in the fabric of our country about what happened in 1945, that reforming out-league government wanted to do something that made us feel equal. It treats everybody equally. The NHS, a working class boy like me could end up in a bed next door to Stephen. It's
perish the thought.
Perish the thought. But I do think that policy that Attlee put forward and that Labour delivered all those years ago, it's something that's actually cherished by the British people. It works. This whole idea that everybody puts in and everybody benefits from it, and that's where it should be.
Do you know, I think that's precisely what was wrong. What was astonishing, wasn't it, after 1945, was that the Labour slogan in the first election was "Praise Churchill, vote Labour," and that's very much how the country felt. And then you had a government under Clement Attlee that went for the kind of nationalisation of almost everything that moved, flew, drove or anything else, which, was pretty akin to what happened in the Soviet Union, except they did it more efficiently. And one of the consequences of
the
that...
creation of the welfare state, the NHS, a disaster.
Right.
Wasn't it homes fit for heroes?
Well, you see, the point is that there were some wonderful, wonderful gains out of that exist to this day. That's precisely the point. And the one that really made us, as Britons, proud. I'm pleased to say I was born long before the NHS came into existence.
Surely not.
I can't say that I took an active part in this particular protest, but for what it's worth, yes, I'm afraid it is true. The fact, and this is a serious point, and I make it because I don't hear it enough. At the time, the only country in the world where healthcare was free at the point of delivery, based on your needs rather than your means, very well chosen words by Aaron Bevan, was the United Kingdom. It was an astonishing achievement. And I think a lot of our pride in our NHS stems from that.
OK.
The reality is that 2 million people are now directly employed by the NHS.
I told you we'd agree on something.
We want to hear from the other two panellists as well. Salma?
Well, there's a lot there that I agree with what Steve has already said in terms of free at the point of use. The only sort of point of difference that I want to bring out is I don't like this idea of just because somebody's rich and therefore they're not entitled. Or there is obviously an issue that Sean is bringing out, because why do we need to curtail the use? Because perhaps the NHS isn't working as well as it should for Sean. There's certainly a lot of experience of that. But that shouldn't mean that other people don't get the entitlement that they've paid for because the service isn't working. We should be asking a different question. The answer is not saying that certain people should be cut out of a system or a process because it's not working. It should be that let's ask better questions about waiting lists, better questions about efficiencies. I mean, Parmjit just said that he was on the board of a trust. Trusts do run themselves effectively through an independent body of NHS England. We should be asking better questions about policy and the way things are run.
What about this question that was put by Julie Etchingham to Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak last night about sort of if you had a loved one in a long waiting list, would you use private healthcare? Sunak immediately said yes, and then Keir Starmer said no. Now, I found that quite shocking. Did you have that same reaction?
No, because I think the difficulty with that is that if you're talking about a loved one, you have to make the choices that you can make for yourself, for that person that's right. I think it's an odd question to ask because every circumstance will be completely different. And making that choice is not necessarily a straightforward one for what the healthcare is.
Well, I think it is necessary in many cases, isn't it? I mean, if you have a child that has anorexia and needs urgent mental health care or even, dare I say, an operation, you're going to do whatever you can as a parent to bring that about, aren't you?
Yes, but that's one particular case. I mean, if you're talking about a loved one, could it mean somebody who's elderly? Could it mean somebody who's got a terminal illness? Could it mean somebody who's, in whatever situation it is? I think it's a slightly unfair question to ask a politician because it sort of brings in that personal. And I know politics is about the personal, but questions like that, actually, I find quite irksome.
Well, I thought it was wrong to ask for a yes or no answer, I have to say. But
I mean, and that's what it boils down to at the end of the day. And that's why I find these questions quite difficult for politicians, because it's not simple. And if you ask a politician to answer it in that way, then the way that they think about how treatment is going to be for patients that they're responsible for, ultimately, it also becomes binary.
Stephen Bush.
Well, look, we're one of a large number of countries where we aim for everyone to have healthcare free at the point of use. However, we are basically the only one where we don't have some form of co-payment model, so some kind of social insurance on top. Almost certainly we would be more efficient, closer to the standards of the best European healthcare if we did have some co-payment, some social insurance model. Obviously, that doesn't mean anything like what they have in the United States. But I think it is, however, important to remember, exactly as Steve was saying, that every taxpayer, including the wealthy people, do pay into the NHS. They are part of the social contract too. Therefore, they deserve to be able to use the same goods and services as everybody else.
OK, let's move on to something else that happened in the debate last night. Let's go to a text question from Theo, who says, should there be consequences if political candidates lie? For example, the Prime Minister at last night's debate. Now, Keir Starmer has alleged that Rishi Sunak lied to the country and broke the ministerial code when he claimed Labour's spending plans would increase taxes by £2,000. Now, this has become a very big story today, and Keir Starmer has called Rishi Sunak a liar, which is, I think, quite something for a political leader to do. Stephen, let's start with you. How do you analyse this?
Well, I suppose the way I would analyse it is that, broadly speaking, the Prime Minister has said something which is not wholly true, and he's left himself open to be attacked on the substance, whereas if he hadn't overcooked the attack, we would today be talking about the fact that whoever wins is going to have to put up taxes, and Labour are not being straight with us and the Conservatives are not being straight with us on that, and that would be a more uncomfortable conversation for the Labour Party. So in some ways I think the answer to the question is we are already seeing what ought to happen to politicians when they mislead us, is that they're being punished for it. If Rishi Sunak had stood up and just levelled with the public and said, look, we're an ageing democracy, we have neighbourhood politics getting worse, we have a bunch of pressures on the public, says, I will have to raise taxes, but I will do it in a responsible way, and the Labour Party will always go further than that, people would have been much more responsive to that than him effectively trying to argue that water flows uphill.
But he repeated it so many times last night. I think for a lot of people, that will be the takeaway from that debate. People who maybe don't follow politics in the same way that we all do, but they'll watch an election debate, but they won't necessarily watch all of the shenanigans that go on the media the next day. So by doing that, Salma Shah, he has effectively misled a lot of people.
The question here is whether the Conservative analysis that was used on the basis of Treasury figures, in the way that it was presented, whether that was fair in an election campaign. In the context that he used it, Keir Starmer had 50 minutes to refute that. And he also has an opportunity now, because we are in the heat of a general election campaign, to say this is what Labour's tax plan is going to be. So I think this is fair insofar as he is suggesting this is what Labour is going to do, and Labour has an opportunity to come back. That's how democracy works. I think this procedural thing that Keir Starmer is using is very interesting, which is, I'm going to say that you have undermined the system in order to come up with this, and that's how I'm going to undermine your argument, rather than doing what you're saying that Rishi should have done, is level with people and say, look, it's true, I am going to have to raise taxes, but I'm going to do it in a responsible, non-traditional Labour way.
Parmjit, Keir Starmer did commit a bit of an error last night by not rebutting it in any meaningful way. Only right at the end did he even sort of seem to comprehend what Rishi Sunak was saying.
Watching it, I think it was very difficult for him because Sunak was in full kind of yap mode. It was very hard to get in.
Hadn't he?
And the host couldn't get a word in, and quite rightly, wanted to say, he did say, can I get a word in edgeways?
Yeah, but that was weak.
But I don't think it was weak. I think he ended up looking more prime ministerial, and Sunak looked like leader of the opposition trying to score points. So I think sometimes
Did he
looking
look
a
like
bit
a prime
reserved.
minister that was going to raise our taxes, though?
No, not look, this whole £2,000 figure. If you've seen the letter that was sent by the permanent secretary in the Treasury, he makes it very clear this is not to be used for political purposes. This is not a forecast of what Labour are going to spend, and yet he chose to do it anyway. He's either been very, very badly advised, and just on the train on the way in, I actually had a tweet from Zach, my son, who's 18. He just said, have you seen the Instagram account at LBC? I'm not a big one for Instagram, but I took a look. And yeah, there it's quite clear. Did he lie? Did he break the ministerial code? Well, if he knew and had advice from the permanent secretary that you should not use this in this context because it does not in any way refer to Labour's spending plans. It's a few spads getting back together. Come on, you know what it's like. You've been a spad yourself for a while. It's not a civil service piece of work. So it's pretty disgraceful, really.
But nobody said it's a civil service piece of work.
Well,
and
no, it was implied that it was a civil service that had done this.
If there are civil service figures, which are publicly released figures, the analysis that you do off the back of Civil Treasury, ONS or any of the other figures are legitimate in terms of your own analysis. Labour can refute that analysis. I'm not saying...
And they are refuting
so,
it.
Fine,
because those figures do not in any way relate to what Labour plans to do.
I have been a former special advisor, and it's not for the permanent secretary of the Treasury to say either way. I mean, this is exactly the conversation that we had over Brexit.
Who else protects the civil servants?
Hang on, because...
But who's attacking the civil servants?
It was Treasury civil servants who basically came up with the figures, wasn't it?
Right, so if they do the analysis, and that analysis is available...
And it wasn't an analysis on what Labour is planning to spend. That's the thing.
And if the Conservatives...
It's what Conservative spads said Labour should spend, or would spend, or could spend. So it's not in any way related to anything that Rachel Reeves has said.
So your only response to this, instead of clarifying what Labour's position is on tax, is to be a procedural one.
They've been very clear. They've been very clear in terms of... The criticism has been, you're saying you're going to add VAT on schools, private schools, and so you're going to do that.
The only thing we do now.
Well, there's a few things actually, but in terms of bringing extra money into the health service, in terms of bringing in more money for teachers in schools. But it has been quite specific. And if you look back to 1997, there were 5 pledges, and it was very, very specific about where the money was coming from. It was a very, very similar criticism. What you need is a chancellor who's going to be trusted to grow the economy, and that's something that's not happening. Another lie he told yesterday is that the economy's turning the corner. It's the slowest growth anywhere in the G7.
That doesn't mean the economy is not turning a corner then, does it?
Growth is projected to be over 2% this year, more than any other European economy.
If you look at everywhere else, we're not keeping up with them.
OK, Steve.
I have a life, which meant that I didn't bother to watch. I thought the whole thing...
Why are you here tonight?
Well, because you were very, very short of people, and I happened to be a few yards away, if you really want to know.
You as well.
But for what it's worth, I've done so many elections over so many decades that I've come to... I've never used to read a manifesto. That was always a ridiculous waste of time and energy, and it just seemed to me that there were more important things to do, like mow the lawn and, basically get my laundry done. I mean, all the kind of things that a serious person would do. And what's the serious point about all this? Well, of course, I did see and read about the consequence of this, which is this accusation that somehow Rishi Sunak had lied. And so I read also the analysis of how he'd got to the figure that he used, and it's multiplying this by that and assuming that this is the function of that and so on and so forth. And it seemed to me that to accuse him of lying was actually misusing the word. You could say his analysis was faulty, if you like, but I don't think this is going to go anywhere. I don't think it's going to make a damn difference. And interestingly, it depends which newspaper you read as to who won. I gather my man seems to have done rather better.
Well, funny enough, that is the next question that we're coming to, which I'll have to excuse you from because you didn't watch it.
Well, thank God for that.
It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:20 on LBC. We have with us Parmjit Dhanda, former Labour Minister, Steve Norris, former Conservative Minister, Salma Shah, political commentator, and Stephen Bush from the Financial Times. Now, Steve can have a little bit of a snooze during this one. It's a text question from Ruby who says, who do your panel think came out on top in last night's TV debate? Well, Steve didn't watch it, so let's go to Parmjit first.
I suspect it's who you have most in common with, really. I thought Rishi came out firing and making lots of noise, and that's probably he needs. When you're 20 points, 25 points behind in the poll, you need to make an impression, and he used that attack line on tax, the one that we've been talking about, a false line. You may say it's a fairer one, but 12 times. 12 times. So it was a case of bang, bang, bang. I thought on the downside, it looked like it was more of a process thing than a debate. And we lost the kind of quality debate that we're lucky enough to have in places like this. I thought Starmer was calm and tried to actually do the politics and listen and try to engage more. So for me, in that respect, he came off better.
I mean, Starmer's, Stephen, I don't know whether you agree with this, but Starmer's mission last night was not to just make a big mistake. And if he came through it unscathed, that was almost a win for him.
Yeah, so Keir Starmer came into that with a 4-0 lead, if all of the polls are right, which we have a lot of evidence to suggest they are. And as you say, his aim simply was to be as defensive and boring as possible. And he mostly, I think, will have felt, and he did, he didn't do a good job. I think the interesting thing here is if in 4 years' time, we're looking at the next set of debates and we're going, Keir Starmer needs a big performance in the debates to turn around the polls. On the evidence of what we saw, he would not be able to do that. But Rishi Sunak, who did need a big performance to do two things, to see off Conservative panic and to turn the situation around, it was a performance and I think has reassured Conservative MPs, but it was not a performance to turn around this election.
Very funny WhatsApp message here from Jake. Did you know that Keir Starmer's dad was a toolmaker?
Yeah.
And did you know his wife works in the NHS too? I think we learned that last night, didn't we, Salma?
I agree with everything that Stephen's just said. I think the great winner was Steve having not tuned in, because actually I found it really boring. It's not like the American TV debates where you get kind of a lot of action and you get the candidates really sort of invested in it. I remember when we called for it, when I was in CCHQ in 2010 and Cameron was there, and we wanted to sort of coax Brown out and get him onto the TV debates because we knew that he was a weak point, and it turned out Nick Clegg won all of those debates. So, be careful what you wish for in this. But what I thought, it was sort of two technocrats having a conversation where neither of them really had a lot of political gusto attached to it. So it wasn't really the appointment viewing that I think that the network would have wanted.
Do you think also, because it was only an hour long, that actually counted against it? I heard Emily Maitlis on the newsagents this morning saying that she thought it was a really good thing that it was only an hour. But I kind of thought, well, you're not going to be able to cover all the subjects in an hour.
Exactly. If you've got an hour and you really want to test the integrity of the messages, then maybe you only ask 3 questions and you have lots of people coming in on those 3 questions. It's interesting. The format is absolutely critical to that communication, which of course the parties don't control, they negotiate. We've got another one on Friday. There'll be lots of interaction on broadcast, but the format is really critical, and I'm not sure that really did a service to what it could have been.
I can't believe I'm actually agreeing with Emily Maitlis. This is a first in my experience.
Lady.
Yeah, she's a brilliant broadcaster.
You may say that, and I couldn't possibly comment. But I tell you what, anything better than an hour-long debate would be a half-hour debate.
Single issue.
I don't agree with that. What I would like to see is just the two of them on stools, on a stage, talking to each other without any moderator at all. Just let them go at it. I think we'd learn far more from that. And you often get that in
Yeah, and that's the great thing about... So there's a great video on YouTube in the 1976 EU referendum of a debate between Roy Jenkins and Tony Benn, and there's nominally a moderator, but he says about 4 things, and they essentially just talk to each other through most of it, with the moderator just moving it on. I did think an hour was in some ways the worst possible length of time. Long enough to be a slog, not long enough to let any of the topics breathe.
And it was less than that with the ad break.
Can I just say, though, that format that you were talking about in the 70s, it's where there was a culture of debate. And I don't want to be really boring and cliched and talk about social media and attention span and all that kind of stuff. But actually, there is a real lack of that talent for debate that people used to really invest in. And now it's just kind of very expensive advisors that come in and tell you the same thing over and over again. And so you end up with this kind of stunted, campaigny kind of slogans, with Rishi talking about tax and Keir Starmer saying nothing at all. And I think that actually that's the problem with these kinds of formats. It's because people don't really know how to debate the issues anymore.
By the way, it was 1975, not 76. I say that not to be a pedant. Well, I suppose I am a pedant, but I know we're going to get texts and tweets on it, so apologies, Stephen. Right, Griff in Saddleworth is on the line, and he has an interesting question. Griff, go ahead.
Good evening, Ian. Thank you for taking my call. Good evening, panel. My question is, would a political party seek an advantage if it looked to reform the elephant in the room, the taxation elephant in the room, council tax?
Well, that's an interesting one. Now, Steve, you were a Conservative minister when council tax was introduced, weren't you?
I was indeed, yes. And I think there's a lot of merit in that question, because right now, for example, it's very, very clear we should have at least 2 or 3 additional bands of tax. And the amount that we actually raise from householders is tiny in terms of the overall take from taxation, and that itself needs addressing. What I find so sad about local government in the UK is that good councils lose and bad councils, bad sets of councillors, if you like, win, not because they can demonstrate any difference on the ground for the people that they're representing, but because the political party to which they're attached happens to be in fashion. And so I think a proper reform of council tax would say, let's start with the idea that actually local councils do raise mostly their own money. Now, that'll mean that directly I pay more tax to my local council, and that would need to be offset by my paying less tax to the Exchequer. But then the overall, sort of communist system that we have in this country, whereby, the Treasury rules okay everywhere, every time, is something that some government's going to need to break in due course. So as far as I'm concerned, yes, I think it's a very good question, and I think there's an enormous amount that could be done. Will any government, particularly in its first term, be brave enough to take it on? I fear not.
And that's a problem, isn't it, Stephen? Because however you reform it, there's going to be more losers than winners.
Yeah, this is the problem with tax reform, which, broadly speaking, we really do need to have some in the United Kingdom. National insurance and income tax are one area, the very iniquitous and unhelpful tax rates you face when you hit over a certain amount. But these are all things which have lots of winners in the long term, but are quite painful in the short term. And one of the things which is quite dispiriting about this election campaign is it is very much a contest, I feel, between two political parties who both want to say, oh no, there are easy choices. Oh, don't worry. I'm going to spend 2.5 on defence, but I will also keep cutting your taxes, or I'm going to improve public services, and the only people will pay will be people who have VAT on private schools. And these are both fantasies. And we need policies like council tax reform, serious planning reform, things which are actually going to get growth going and things which create losers ultimately.
Salma?
So the best department I ever worked in was the communities department, and we were absolutely crucified for changing business rates because there'd been a freeze, and so there'd been a massive increase for over the period of 7 years where they had gone up, and so it's not an easy thing to do. I think the difficulty with council tax in particular is not just about how the ability of councils to raise. It's the fact that a lot of people will be unfairly penalised because of house price inflation, so they don't necessarily have the money, ready, but because of the value of their homes, they're going to have to pay a lot. But as you say, Stephen, there are going to have to be losers, and there are going to have to be some policies that hopefully change the system of where most people have their wealth, which is in their home and in their one primary asset. So it is going to be difficult. I think there is never going to be a perfect time to do it, and you have to rip the sticking plaster off, because if we are going to realise any of this and put it back into public services, we need that. One point, though, is that we need to see a dramatic improvement in the way local government is held to account and the way they deliver services. And it's not just about the politicians, it is about the officials that run local government, because it's not just a question of falling rates that have contributed to council collapses. I think there is also mismanagement there in serious ways that we need to look at.
Okay, Parmjit.
I think Griff's original point was about banding, wasn't it, in local government? And he's absolutely right. And I think Salma made a good point earlier on about social media and it becoming harder and harder to do things, because all of a sudden, clickbait culture, you're going to get hammered for it. But even when I was an MP and a candidate in elections, marginal seat, the issue of council tax banding would come up. It does need to be done. At the minute, you can see streets where you've got much bigger houses paying less because they've never been rebanded, and they've changed over the years, than houses down the road that are paying more. It's crazy.
But it's the sort of thing that
won't
government...
happen unless you can find consensus.
Well, if a government comes in with a massive majority, then they could do it. But no party is going to put it in their manifesto, are they?
No. Well, and even when they haven't put it in their manifesto, those lovely Lib Dems, they're not here today, would go out and put out leaflets at election time saying Labour's going to do this at the next election, just as a bit of a scare story. And we've seen similar things on other contentious issues, like social care is a good one. There was actually a consensus between Labour and the Conservatives going into the 2010 election. The election starts, and it was called a death tax by George Osborne. It killed it and became a big issue. And you saw the giant posters with gravestones, death tax. And you just think, well, if only we could actually work through some of these big things together, rather than constly trying to fight.
Now you're just being silly.
Well, I know it's daft, isn't it? But you do need to on those big things.
We did introduce a social care levy on local authorities as well to assist with social care specifically. So, it's not as if that there haven't been efforts that have been made in order to...
It was a long way short of the Dilnot reforms that were building some real cross-party consensus, which would have made a difference.
Can I just very quickly make one point where I actually think there would be a very broad consensus right across the country? It's absolutely iniquitous that a person who owns a property worth 20 or 30 million pounds is paying less in some cases than a person living in the top existing band in one of those councils where, as it happens, the top band will perhaps be, say, £3,000 or more. I think introducing at least 3 more bands that say, if you're living in a £30 million house in America, you'd be paying $3 million.
I remember listening to George Osborne and Ed Bull's their podcast, and they talked about this. And George Osborne said that's what he was going to do at one point.
It's blindingly obvious.
But I can't remember the reason he gave as to why he didn't. There was a perfectly valid reason why he didn't, but I can't remember what it was. That's not much help to anyone,
Was he out of government by that point?
Yes.
No. He wanted to do it as Chancellor, but the Treasury officials told him, well, if you do this, it has these consequences. Can't remember what the consequences were, but that's why he didn't do it. Anyway, let's dig myself out of that particular hole and tell you that it's 8:33 and it's news headlines time with Daryl Jackson.
Sir Keir Starmer's accused Rishi Sunak of repeatedly lying during their TV election debate last night over Labour's tax plans. The statistics watchdogs looking into the Prime Minister's claims of £2,000 higher bills under Labour, which the Tories insist follows independent Treasury analysis. Vaughan Gething says he will continue as the First Minister of Wales despite losing a confidence vote. The motion was put forward by the Tories, a move Mr Gething's called a desperate gimmick. And 100 firefighters have brought a fire at a block of flats in East London under control. Pictures on social media earlier showed smoke billowing into the air from the building in Hackney. LBC weather, another chilly night with some showers in the north, drier elsewhere and a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:37. A kind listener called Michael has helped my memory. He says the reason Osborne didn't introduce it is because Cameron blocked it. It would have developed into a wealth tax, which the Conservatives had vowed wouldn't be introduced. Now, I don't think that was the reason. I think that has sparked my memory. And George Osborne said on that podcast that it was because they would be accused of bringing in a mansion tax by the back door, which, if you remember, was Lib Dem policy at the time. So I think that explains it. We have with us on our panel tonight Parmjit Dhanda, Steve Norris, Salma Shah and Stephen Bush. A text question from Linda. Can the Labour Party get away with so brazenly purging the left? Well, Faiza Shaheen has today announced she'll be standing as an independent in Chingford and Woodford Green. Others standing in that constituency are Chris Brodie for the Greens, Josh Hadley for the Liberal Democrats, Yousaf Khan for the Workers' Party, Paul Lugari of Reform UK and Sir Ian Duncan-Smith for the Conservatives and Sharma Tatler for Labour. I imagine that Sir Ian Duncan-Smith was having a party when he heard the news this afternoon that Faiza Shaheen would be standing. Parmjit, let's come to you first. It does seem incredible the number of Labour left-wing candidates that have been purged just in the last week or two.
Well, when an election's called, this is the process that all parties have always used. They've got to get candidates, 650 of them in place, very, very quickly. So,
but they had candidates in place and they've now replaced them.
Well, they haven't replaced all of them. Some of them they didn't. Some have decided to retire. So
No. I'm talking about these left-wing ones that aren't acceptable in Keir Starmer's modern Labour Party.
You're talking specifically about Chingford there, aren't you?
Yeah, but there's plenty of other examples.
Well, it's one of those things where due diligence in the Labour Party is something I suppose we've learnt the hard way. We've had a really, really difficult time, not least when Jeremy was leader, in terms of some of the candidates. Anyone says anything, even if they're not even a winnable seat these days. You've had a little bit of an experience yourself. You say something, it stays there, and it can... The perception is whether it's true or not, but the perception you decided not to.
It's only a question of which of us got him first.
Can I just say though?
This is.
But Parmjit, that's exactly the point.
Be careful.
Ian made a choice about as a perspective as going forward for the candidacy. This isn't about individual choices. This is about the system telling them you can't stand for us. Yeah. And I think that is very interesting because Tory associations, they like to choose their candidates. You get a lot of stuff, I accept even in the Conservative Party now, where CCHQ wants to play certain candidates and rules will allow them to do so in this window. But this is something that's much more fundamental, which is about what is happening on the left with the Labour Party, this rush to Blairism. It seems to be the entire electoral strategy. And what does that actually mean for your broad church?
Historically, it means 3-0.
Can I just come back a little? You're right. Parties should choose their candidates, and the overwhelming majority have. We're talking about selections that have happened. We didn't know that an election was going to be called for July. I think, like most people, I thought it was going to be November. I thought it might even be December, actually.
But do local parties choose them, or do central?
At this stage, this has always been the rules in the Labour Party. Once an election is called, the NEC panel will sit and put those candidates in place. All the others prior to that period, yes, there's selections done by local parties exactly the same way that all the other parties try to do, and the members will choose them, and that's what's happened. And yes, members have chosen quality candidates across the board. We might not like that, or you might not like that. But
was Faiza Shaheen not a quality candidate then?
Well, in her particular case, I don't know what the circumstances are.
But it is odd, isn't it?
She's meant to have liked something on social media.
But they've left it until now, where they know that they can impose another candidate. All of these tweets were public knowledge months and months ago. They could have done it all then, and they've left it to now. Similar things are happening in the Conservative Party. Tonight, Billericay and, I can't remember what's it called? Billericay.
Basil and
Billericay. The local Conservative Association there have had Richard Holden, the chairman of the Conservative Party, foisted upon them. He's the only candidate in the selection. They've actually cancelled the selection meeting. Now that, is, I would say, tantamount to corruption.
No, I don't think corruption is the right word, but I think it's pretty crass, if you know what I mean. I've just seen the news that the leader of Barking and Dagenham Darren Rodwell, has been told he's no longer the candidate for the safe seat of Barking, which Margaret Hodge is going to be leaving. And I can tell you, I know pretty much all of the leaders of all 33 councils in London, and I would say, if he's not the best, he's very close to the best. He's the best house builder. He's transformed a council that was once run by the BNP, of all things. And yet apparently he's not acceptable. Well, having taken it for granted that he was going to be the candidate, suddenly on a day he's told, you're out.
Look, I think that's
well, let me just clarify on that. Allegations have been made against him. The Labour Party have decided those allegations need to be looked into.
Yeah.
They've replaced him with the leader of Enfield Council, who has had bullying allegations made against
when you look at these words, allegations, that's a wonderful word to use. Allegations, in other words, no proof whatever. No actual proof of even substance, never mind fact.
Before we get into the details, I think we'd probably better halt that particular discussion.
And generally, it's very hard sitting around a table like this talking about information that none of us are privy to. We don't know what those committees have seen. We don't know what discussions have been had. So there may well be good reasons why people have not been selected, but it's very, very hard to be able to comment on that, sat round this table, not having been privy to any of that information.
I think we can say that Morgan McSweeney has one job, and it is to eliminate any left-winger he can possibly do from the...
And he's doing a brilliant job on that, isn't he?
As far as Richard Holden's concerned, he's the chairman of the Conservative Party, and somebody, in my view, rather crassly has said, we've got to find him a seat, find him a decent one, and end of. Does that make it right? No. I think it's crass, frankly.
So what we're saying is all parties are as bound as each other on this, I guess.
I think what I'm taking from this is that we need to be much more worried about a democratic deficit more fundamentally over the next 2 decades.
Well, this is the problem with our electoral system. If you have safe seats are always going to primarily be about the decisions made, if you're lucky, by party activists, and a lot of the time by the top of the party. Look, I say to someone who lives in Hackney North and Stoke Newington, where the last meaningful vote over who our MP was happened in 1987, right? And the mistake Labour have made this time is by trying to do that with Diane Abbott, such a high-profile person, this whole grubby practice and both of the parties engage in is front and centre. So I think that they will both pay a slight tax for it. I suspect that the Conservatives will do slightly less well in Basildon and Billericay than they otherwise would do, but they got a lot of votes to lose there. Ditto Labour have got a lot of votes to lose in these very safe seats, so they'll get away with it.
And one of the consequences will be that in each of these constituencies, and there are plenty more that we could have talked about, the local party will experience a big fall-off in membership, because if local members think that they're being sidelined or ignored, why would you be a member of your local party?
Absolutely.
Just to answer this question from someone who's texted in, I'm a bit confused. Are parliamentary candidates allowed to present a radio show? You need not be confused, because parliamentary candidates are indeed not allowed to present a radio show. And just for clarification, I'm not a parliamentary candidate and won't be.
And a shame.
Well, my own fault, isn't it?
Well, it was a terrible place to live, apparently, wasn't it? Anyway.
Thank you, Steve. Oh, what a shame we have to go to a break. It's 8:45.
Britain decides. Follow the general election and have your say only with LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Stephen Bush, Salma Shah, Parmjit Dhanda still with us. Steve Norris has sadly had to leave the studio for reasons unexplained. No, he is still here, really. A text question from Simon, who says, 80 years since D-Day tomorrow. Do today's children know enough about our country's past? Well, a study suggests that fewer than half of young UK adults know what D-Day actually is. Stephen Bush.
I think, to be honest, that poll would have produced that result pretty much any time after 1960. Like, people's knowledge of the past is, as you know, someone who studied history, loves history, is not as good as I would like it to be at any point in time. However, one of the things which Sunak said, which was true in yesterday's debate, is that kids in England are very well educated now. We have really good schools for English, really good schools for maths. So actually, we are doing pretty well on that kind of thing.
Salma?
I have always been very concerned about what happens when living memory begins to fade. And we're starting to see a lot of that now. And D-Day and these commemorations are very important in terms of that. And I think to answer the question directly, I do think we're losing some of this in history and people's interest in why we are where we are. I think the commemorations of D-Day remind us that actually the world order that came as a consequence of the Second World War and post-Cold War is now at risk, and it is going to change, and it is changing. We're living through that change at the moment. And so people have fundamentally lost some of the reasoning and the understanding as to why things have been done the way that they have. And I think that a reminder of that, especially with commemorations, is very important nationally. And I think, being able to introduce history in a much more fundamental way about how we live today is important.
Parmjit.
So I just would echo everything that's been said, really. It's not a lot to add to it, that these events were really, really important in history. They matter to us today, and we all have a responsibility, I suppose we do in terms of teaching history. But I think we also have those of us who are parents as well to try and pass that information down. One of the proudest things that I used to talk about when I was an MP down at the Legion in Gloucester was my grandfather came down. He was actually a member of the Royal Bengal Engineers in the Second World War, turbaned, bearded fella. And I'll never forget the level of affection that members of the Royal British Legion showed to him, and the Burma Star Regiment, who had an affinity locally as well. So we just got to do whatever we can to keep those family ties alive. But it's not just about the school, it's about what we do as individuals.
Do you think we need to look at the way we teach history? Because I don't know an awful lot about the current history curriculum, but certainly it used to be that, history ended in 1939. Maybe we need to sort of ratchet that forward a bit now, because I doubt whether D-Day does feature in the history curriculum now. And maybe things like this ought to, Steve.
Yeah, they ought to. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because I sense that somewhere in there is the fact that information is now available on so many levels to young people, and at a level that people my age were never ever exposed to. And I think that almost necessarily means that the pace of information is relentless, and there isn't much time to absorb, what happened 80 years ago. And when Stephen talks about educational standards, I just echo that. I mean, there's no evidence that we're performing badly in this respect. I think it's something we're going to have to accept. And if we say, are we doing enough, for example, to remind people? Well, I think what's really good about the reaction to this 80th anniversary is that we still do have, thank God, just one or two people who took part in the landings. But we've got an awful lot of reflection now on what happened. People are beginning to realise maybe what that meant, and what it meant in the context of the defeat of fascism and the liberation of the rest of Europe and so on. I think that's actually something that I want to see perpetuated. Sadly, in 20 years' time, there will be no one alive who will have direct experience, and we'll all be talking about what our fathers told us and what even our grandfathers told us. I think that's the last. And I don't think this is unreasonable. I think this is happening all over the world in all of these great issues. The speed and relentless amount of information we all absorb on a daily basis is now massively greater than it ever has been in the history of mankind.
My dad was age 10 when the war broke out, 15 when it finished. But he had all sorts of anecdotes because he lived on a farm just next to a US air base, had all sorts of stories. And one of my main regrets in life is I never interviewed him about it. I should have recorded an hour of just all history and I don't know why I didn't. I just kicked myself for it. We're going to talk about this after 9 o'clock, by the way. So if you have views on why maybe the younger generation don't know enough about what happened in the Second World War and the consequences of the peace, I'd love to hear from you after 9.
Can I just say that absent PTSD as an acknowledged issue for people who've been through appalling circumstances. My father went over to Belgium after D-Day, probably about 6 months after, actually, but when there was still a lot going on. He was very typical of his generation. He never spoke about it. I learned more about what my father had done during the war after he died and we were clearing out his and my mother's house than I ever heard from him.
I don't think that's unusual. Right, a text question from Peter in Rotherham. Are the Lib Dems making enough of a splash in this election campaign? Salma.
Do you know, it's always quite hard to tell with the Lib Dems because when they're at this size and with this kind of profile, they do tend to go to ground and run local campaigns and hyper-local campaigns. That's always been my experience of them. So Ed Davey's making these great sort of comedic efforts in the air war with his photographs and things, just to remind people that the Lib Dems are still there. I'd love to know where the Lib Dems have a chance, whether there's potential tactical voting. What are people actually hearing on the ground and what are they getting? Because the Lib Dems are quite canny in that way with how they deploy their resource when they're stuck.
What about these stunts that Ed Davey has been doing?
Well, personally, I think they've enlivened the election campaign, but does that actually change anything as far as the air war's concerned? I don't think so. I think it lets people know that he's there. It doesn't say anything about him, though. And I think you need a bit of that if you're going to get any traction on any of the policy questions that you've got on the ground.
It's interesting. This week, they've gone the other way. They're not doing any stunts. The Lib Dems this evening have released a 3-minute video of Ed Davey with his disabled son and talking about his family background. And it's quite touching in many ways. But it's totally the opposite of what they were doing last week. And I just find that slightly a strange approach. Stephen?
Well, the thing is because, I was about to say that they're not actually even the third party anymore in the House of Commons. So they do have to just fight to remind people that they exist, right? And that is essentially the golden thread of everything Ed Davey will be doing in this campaign. He's released this very touching video talking about his son, something which for a long time Ed really struggled with. I mean, I was the first person to interview him about it when I worked back at the New Statesman, and he really thought the interview had gone badly because it was the first time he'd discussed it. And for them, they just have to remind people that they exist, and in certain parts of the country, they are broadly speaking, we have a 1.5 party system in England. You vote Conservative, and in some parts of the country, the way you vote against the Conservatives is you vote Labour, and in others it's Liberal Democrat. And for the Lib Dems, their focus is going to be going, Ed Davey, he's game for a laugh, he does these things, he's a decent guy, just introducing him to the public. And so the challenge for them is, can they find a way of doing that is new for 4 more weeks? That is going to be quite tricky. That's why elections are often quite hard for them. They get squeezed between that, only Labour and the Conservatives can win here, which is why if you're in a Lib Dem area, you'll be getting a lot of bar charts through your door.
Certainly will. #winning here. Steve?
Well, I thought that silly was just about the way most of my friends seem to, react to the week of Ed falling off things and diving off things and submerging himself in things. I mean, I couldn't see the point of it. I couldn't see the point of it politically. Did he have to tell us what a fun chap he was? Is that the idea? I really couldn't get it. It just didn't seem to me to be the mark of any serious politician. Boris Johnson could get away with hanging on a tripwire because he had the kind of personality that could live with that. I just don't think Ed Davey can. I think he's going to be in much more trouble when I think there's a sub-postmistress, isn't there, standing against him in his own seat. I suspect he'll have a much more serious time when he has to deal with that. And actually, what Stephen said, I think absolutely sums up where the Lib Dems are and what their aims will be in this election. They'll try to win some of those seats back, pardon me, in the southwest of England, which they've traditionally been able to dominate, and with perhaps a few urban seats as well. They will still probably be, I think, the third largest party actually after the election in Parliament, given that we can see an SNP slide and not that much progress for Labour in Scotland.
In fairness to him, he's actually better on a paddleboard than I am, so I'll give him that. But and I suppose he did 2 or 3 of these kinds of falling into water and tripping over and comic routines. But I don't think you can keep doing that through a campaign, or people will think that's a bit absurd. The problem they've got is, I suppose, the comfort zone was always, in 2005 was a good example of it, where they had a strong set of policies, I suppose, quite lefty, based on tuition fees, opposition to war in Iraq, that kind of stuff. Now they're having to kind of position themselves, because a lot of their seats are in places like Surrey and the Shires, and it's kind of positioning themselves to the right, which for a lot of them is really an uncomfortable thing to do. So I just think that they're kind of like a little bit torn at the minute. I think they in terms of what they do, they can be the active foot soldiers and all the rest of it, but in terms of ideology, there's a bit of a gap there. So he's had to do something to try and capture the attention, and he has, fair enough, but he couldn't keep on doing that, because I think otherwise he would have been lampooned.
Now, Steve, you did mention Davies' local race in Kingston and Surbiton, so I now have to read out all the candidates. Ali Abdullah from the Workers' Party of Britain. Oh my God, I can't pronounce this one. Deboyuti Das from the Green Party. Ed Davey from the Liberal Democrats. Helen Edward, Conservative and Unionist Party. Mark Fox, Reform UK. Eunice O'Dame, Labour Party. And Yvonne Tracy, Kingston Independent Residents Group. So thanks for that, Steve, for the second time in the programme.
It's always a pleasure with you. So good to see you here. The voters.
We are very grateful to see you.
Yes.
Now, our fun question is from Leah. Lib Dem leader Ed Davey admits he's been done for speeding on the M1. What's the naughtiest thing your panellists have been caught doing in the past year or so? Just as well you said the past year or so, isn't it? I was caught speeding in exactly the same stretch of the M1 than Ed Davey, so I have something in common with him at last. Parmjit.
I haven't had a very naughty year, but the year is still relatively young, I suppose. But,
it says a year or so.
Yeah, I think in our household there is a bit of a habit of kind of like gorging on sweet things, and I try not to do it, and I have been secretly nicking sweets and chocolates and biscuits in the house.
That's almost as bad as Theresa May's answer to this question, isn't it?
I know it is, isn't it? Let's see
if we can do better with the rest of the panel. Okay. Stephen.
So this isn't very rock and roll either, I'm afraid. I recently went to see at the Barbican Isata Kanu Mason and his sister play a piano concerto. They were brilliant. But in the interval, we got a bottle of wine and we hadn't quite finished it, and you're not allowed to take glass into the Barbican, but my friend smuggled it in her handbag, and we did continue to pour it into our plastic glasses at the back while enjoying the beautiful music, and now I'm never going to be allowed to go back into the Barbican again.
You naughty boy. Salma.
I don't do bad things, obviously. Okay, I fib to my children. I mean, that's like the worst thing that I do, little white lies.
Steve, help us out here.
Well, I can. It's not so much something bad.
You've got experience in
just something deeply, deeply stupid. Do you remember that wonderful scene that Dawn French did in that programme where she's the Vicar of Dibley?
Yeah.
Which is where she's bouncing along a path and off she goes and up to her neck. That was me.
Really?
On the beach at Brancaster with my dog. Tide was a bit high. And I thought, well, I'll just jump over this little puddle. And I was in it up to my neck.
Really?
Fortunately, I was able to extricate myself. Have you ever tried to walk half a mile absolutely soaked to the skin? Well, I have. And I can tell you, I didn't tell anybody but my very, very closest family.
Well, if there were a prize for the answer for this question, you would be the undoubted winner of it. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to all of you for joining us for Cross Question. Parmjit Dhanda, Steve Norris, Salma Shah and Stephen Bush. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to return to the subject of D-Day. Tomorrow, the 6th of June, was the day that Allied troops went across the Channel and started the Long March to Berlin. I want to talk about why maybe we don't, as it's 80 years on, why we don't really understand all of the full implications of what happened 80 years ago. The bravery that so many British, American, Canadian, Commonwealth soldiers showed on that night. We're going to talk to somebody who will take us through what was happening at 9 o'clock on the 5th of June, because imagine that you know that you're about to embark on this operation in about 12 hours' time. I wonder what went through all of their minds.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Sir Keir Starmer's told LBC the ministerial code was broken by the Prime Minister last night when he said Labour's policies would cost households £2,000 in tax.
Yes, he breached the ministerial code because he lied, and he lied deliberately, because we have made clear that our plans